In 1945, Germany wasn't just defeated, it was dismantled. The cities of Germany lay in ruins. Its economy had collapsed. Its political leadership was meant to disappear forever. The Allies promised a clean break from the Nazi past, a total purge, a fresh start. But behind that promise was a different reality. As the Cold War began, rebuilding Germany fast became more important than rebuilding it perfectly. So instead of removing everyone connected to the old regime, many were quietly kept in place. Economists, administrators, and industrial experts. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't incompetence. It was a calculated decision, and it helped transform a destroyed nation into one of the strongest economies in the world. By the end of World War II, Germany no longer functioned as a modern state. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were barely recognizable. Bridges had been destroyed. Railways were unusable. Energy supplies were unreliable. Water systems were damaged. Millions of people lived in temporary shelters or makeshift huts with no access to proper sanitation. Daily life was a struggle for survival. Industrial production had collapsed. Coal mines were flooded or destroyed. Steel mills were inoperative. Factories were abandoned because transportation networks could no longer deliver raw materials. Production capacity was down to a fraction of pre-war levels. The infrastructure required to support manufacturing simply didn't exist. Food shortages were extreme. Grain production had fallen sharply, while fuel and transport disruptions made distribution erratic. Malnutrition became widespread, particularly among children and the elderly. Black markets grew, offering coffee, sugar, and cigarettes at astronomical prices. Even essentials like milk, bread, and potatoes were heavily rationed. Millions of refugees poured into the country. Germans expelled from the East arrived in a homeland that could barely support the existing population. Families were separated, children orphaned, and social services overwhelmed. The Reichsmark was effectively worthless. Barter replaced currency. Cigarettes, coffee, and sugar became mediums of exchange. Trust in the formal economy had vanished. Politically, the country had been erased. The Nazi Party was banned. Government institutions dissolved. Military structures dismantled. Central authority was replaced by allied military governments, divided into zones administered by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. For Allied planners, this devastation was not simply a consequence of defeat. It was a blank slate, a chance to rebuild Germany from the ground up. The guiding principle was simple. Nazism had to be removed completely, or it would return. Yet even in this chaos, everyday life quietly persisted. Families scavenged what they could. Farmers managed tiny plots to feed their communities. Local networks of neighbors and relatives became informal safety nets, compensating for the collapse of state services. These small acts of survival laid the groundwork for the society that would eventually rebuild. Refugees brought not only hardships, but also skills, trades, and expertise. Many craftspeople and technicians found themselves integrating into new communities, offering a patchwork workforce that would prove vital in the reconstruction. In the ruins of Berlin and Hamburg, children played amidst rubble, scavenging old bricks and wood to build tiny shelters or toys. These small gestures of resilience reflected the human instinct to rebuild, long before formal reconstruction could begin. Denazification was intended as both a moral reckoning and a political safeguard. Its goal was to remove Nazi influence from every layer of society. Party members, civil servants, judges, teachers, industrial managers, journalists, and economists were investigated and categorized. Those deemed responsible were to be removed from power, barred from employment, or prosecuted. Allied authorities developed a classification system. Germans were sorted into major offenders, offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated persons. Ideally, those most responsible would face consequences, while minor participants would be monitored or restricted. The logic was clear. Germany needed leadership that had no ties to the regime that caused its collapse. But almost immediately, the scale of the problem became apparent. By 1945, Nazi affiliation was not limited to a small ideological elite. Party membership and involvement in affiliated organizations were widespread across nearly every profession. For teachers, engineers, economists, and factory managers, joining the party was often a requirement to continue working or advance careers. Many joined out of necessity rather than ideology. Removing all of them would also remove nearly all of the people capable of running Germany. The dilemma was more than administrative, it was existential. A country stripped entirely of its experienced managers and bureaucrats risked total collapse. Yet retaining them carried moral and political consequences. The Allies faced a choice: enforce purity at the cost of chaos, or tolerate compromise to restore order. The contradiction quickly became clear. The same individuals who were supposed to be purged were also the ones who understood logistics, finance, production, and governance. Without their knowledge, the country could not function. New, ideologically clean administrators often lacked experience. Many had never managed factories, supervised transport networks, or handled large bureaucracies. Early reconstruction plans stalled. Production lagged. Administrative bottlenecks multiplied. Recovery seemed impossible. Meanwhile, tensions with the Soviet Union escalated rapidly. By 1947, the Cold War was no longer hypothetical. It was influencing policy decisions across Europe. Germany's instability suddenly became a geopolitical concern. A weak Germany was no longer just a moral problem, it was a strategic threat. Prolonged chaos risked social unrest, increased Soviet influence, and the spread of extremist ideologies. The original logic of denazification collided with a new geopolitical reality. The geopolitical landscape reshaped occupation policy. The Soviet Union consolidated control over Eastern Europe, including its occupation zone in Germany. Western allies needed a stable, functioning West Germany, not just for economic reasons, but for political and strategic purposes. Germany was to demonstrate that capitalism and democracy could deliver prosperity and stability. It needed to be a showcase, a model for the Western world. Denazification did not end overnight, but enforcement slowed. Investigations were delayed, restrictions were relaxed. Individuals previously considered compromised were reclassified, pardoned, or quietly reinstated. Purification gave way to stabilization. The decision was strategic. The Allies calculated that a functioning West Germany could serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, offering a model of prosperity and democracy in contrast to the Eastern Bloc. Germany was no longer just a defeated nation. It had become a front line of the ideological struggle defining the coming decades. The post-war German state relied on continuity as much as reform. Civil servants returned to office. Judges resumed their duties. Economic planners and industrial managers re-entered ministries and factories. Knowledge of procedures, logistics, and institutional structures was indispensable. Allied authorities monitored this continuity, and in many cases, it was actively tolerated. Germany could not be rebuilt by people who had never run it. The practical necessity of continuity applied most acutely to the economy. Without experienced professionals, recovery would have been slow, chaotic, and vulnerable to social unrest. It wasn't just about rebuilding factories or roads. It was about restoring trust. Citizens needed to see that public services were functioning, that markets could operate, and that the state could manage scarcity. Experienced administrators were the key to that trust. Germany's economic recovery was deliberate and managed. Economists, engineers, industrial managers, and financial experts, many of whom had careers spanning both pre-war and wartime Germany, were central to rebuilding the nation. Their institutional knowledge enabled factories to restart, supply chains to reconnect, and production systems to function. Ludwig Erhard, later Minister of Economics, exemplified this approach. He promoted a social market economy, balancing market mechanisms with social safeguards, but relied on a bureaucracy staffed by experienced professionals. Currency reform restored confidence in the economy, lifting black market dependence. Price liberalization encouraged production and distribution. Labor markets stabilized, employment grew, and consumer goods returned to stores. External aid, particularly the Marshall Plan, provided capital, machinery, and access to international markets. Yet aid alone could not generate growth. Coordination, planning, and operational expertise were essential. Factories, once silent and abandoned, began producing again. Steel rolled off the presses, coal was mined efficiently, transportation systems were repaired, connecting cities to ports and borders. Germany's industrial revival was methodical, not accidental. Smart entrepreneurs also played a role. Bakers, carpenters, and shopkeepers reopened businesses, often improvising with limited supplies. Their resilience demonstrated that recovery was not only a macroeconomic effort, but a human one, fueled by determination and ingenuity. Refugee communities often pooled labor and resources. Families who had lost everything built shared kitchens, repaired housing together, and organized makeshift schools. This grassroots collaboration accelerated recovery at the community level. The narrative that post-war Germany was rebuilt entirely by new faces is misleading. Recovery relied on a hybrid system. New democratic political structures, pre-existing administrative expertise, and integration with Western economic networks. This combination enabled a rapid resurgence. Industrial output surged, exports grew, living standards improved year by year. By the mid-1950s, the phrase Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, entered common usage. Yet even this term obscures the underlying mechanism. Policy, expertise, and pragmatism drove recovery, not miracles. Every policy reform, from taxation to trade, was implemented by people who had navigated the old system. Their understanding of industrial bottlenecks, labor markets, and supply chains accelerated recovery far faster than any new cadre could have achieved. Recovery was not just industrial, it was human. Workers returned to factories, families rebuilt homes from rubble, children returned to schools that had been destroyed, often in temporary facilities. Markets reopened, small businesses resumed operations, slowly restoring livelihoods. Local civil servants who had once been party members were now essential mediators between citizens and authorities. Their experience allowed towns to manage resource allocation, rationing, and reconstruction projects efficiently. Every small victory, a repaired railway, a reopened school, a functioning hospital, reinforced stability and public confidence. These small human successes collectively fueled the broader economic miracle. Even in ordinary towns, residents could feel the impact. A reopened bakery meant bread for children. A repaired tram line meant workers could reach factories on time. Small but essential improvements became symbols of normalcy and hope. Community initiatives like volunteer fire brigades and citizen councils helped manage resources locally. Their actions preserved morale and created a sense of ownership in the reconstruction process. The German population had to adapt to a new reality. Traditional elites had been discredited, but new institutions relied heavily on their knowledge. Communities grappled with the tension between the past and the present. Cultural life slowly revived. Newspapers, theaters, and radio returned. While political reckoning was delayed, ordinary Germans began to re-engage with civic life and democratic institutions. Schools reopened gradually, teaching a new generation about democracy and civic responsibility, while communities rebuilt churches, libraries, and community centers that had been destroyed. The reconstruction of society, like the economy, was gradual and layered. Each step reinforced confidence that Germany could function again without reverting to authoritarian rule. West Germany's rapid recovery also shaped Europe and the global stage. A stable, prosperous Germany acted as a bulwark against communism. It demonstrated the viability of a market economy and democratic governance in a country that had once been the epicenter of totalitarianism. The European Economic Community, NATO, and transatlantic trade relied heavily on Germany's industrial output. Its recovery created ripple effects across Europe, stabilizing the continent and bolstering Western alliances. History rarely offers simple narratives. Germany's post-war recovery defies binary judgments. Denazification did not collapse by accident. It was reshaped because circumstances demanded speed, experience, and pragmatism. The compromise that weakened moral purification strengthened economic recovery. This tension between justice and stability defines the post-war German experience. Germany's economic miracle was not the result of forgetting the past, nor was it built on a complete break from it. It emerged from a deliberate choice to reuse what already existed in order to prevent something worse. The Cold War demanded speed, stability demanded expertise, and in meeting those demands, the Allies helped create one of the most dramatic economic recoveries of the 20th century. Not despite denazification's failure, but partly because of it. The story reminds us that history is often shaped not by ideals alone, but by the careful balance of necessity, pragmatism, and the imperfect decision of people trying to make a devastated world function again. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing and press the bell icon for more in-depth history content. And as always, thank you for your time.